Welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today we are tackling a huge one, maybe the biggest one of all. We're talking about consciousness.
The big C.
Yeah, we are diving deep. And to help us navigate this incredibly complex, incredibly mysterious topic, we have Owen Flanagan's book, The Conscious Mind.
A fantastic book.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting because I feel like we all kind of just go about our day. And every now and then you sort of stop and you think, wait, how is it that I'm aware? Like, what does it even mean to be conscious?
Yeah, how am I experiencing the world right now? It's so bizarre when you think about it. And Flanagan actually starts by acknowledging that even just trying to define consciousness can be a total headache.
Right. Of course. So many different definitions out there.
Yeah, he even quotes another writer, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it was something like, nothing worth reading has ever been written on the subject.
Wow. Okay. That's a strong statement.
Right. But clearly, Flanagan disagrees, and after we take a look at his book, I think you might too.
Okay. So if we're going to get into this, we have to start with the basics. How does Flanagan define consciousness? How does he even start to approach something so massive?
Well, he begins with this idea that consciousness is about having perceptions, thoughts, and feelings. It's about awareness, that feeling of what it's like to be a thinking and feeling being.
Okay, so it's not just about processing information, but about the actual feeling of what it's like to experience the world.
Exactly. And he uses these vivid examples to kind of bring this point home. He talks about things like the distinct feel of soft velvet against your skin, or the taste of water. It seems simple, right? But it's actually super unique.
I like that he uses really tangible examples, things that we can all easily relate to.
Totally. And he also talks about how a specific combination of instruments, like in a piece of music, like piano and oboe together, can evoke a really specific emotion.
Yeah, yeah.
And he points to all of these things as examples of what he calls the phenomenal aspect of consciousness.
Okay, phenomenal. So this is about the feeling, the subjective experience itself, not just the mechanics of how the brain is processing all this information.
Exactly. Exactly. It's the what it feels like. And this is super important because for a long time, people thought that if we could just crack the code of how the brain works, figure out all the neurons firing, the signals being sent, if we could map all that out, then we'd automatically understand consciousness.
Makes sense, right? You think you figure out all the nuts and bolts and then boom, you've got consciousness.
Right. Like if you could just see all the moving parts in a car engine, then you'd understand what it feels like to drive.
Right, exactly.
But Flanagan argues that even knowing all that, knowing what the brain does, that doesn't automatically tell us what it feels like to have those brain processes happening.
So you're saying it's kind of like we'd have the owner's manual for the brain, but we wouldn't actually know what it's like to be behind the wheel.
That's a fantastic way to put it. And this is where he says we need to separate what he calls the psychological from the phenomenal.
Okay, two sides of the same coin, or two completely separate things.
Well, the psychological, that's all about the brain's functions, its processes, all the nuts and bolts stuff.
Okay.
But the phenomenal is all about that subjective feeling, that raw experience of being.
So it's not just about the mechanics, but about the feeling itself.
Right. It's that first-person perspective that we can never fully grasp from the outside.
Okay, so even if we had this super detailed map of your brain and we could track every single neuron as it fired, we still wouldn't necessarily know what it feels like to be you at this very moment.
Precisely. It's the what it's likeness.
Mm.
And this insight actually has some pretty big implications for how we think about the mind, especially when you compare it to some of those classic ideas in philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about something that's puzzled philosophers for, what, centuries?
Right, like forever.
Mm.
And, like Descartes, for instance.
Yeah.
He had that whole idea that the mind is totally transparent to itself.
Right, I think, therefore, I am.
Exactly. And he believed that just by introspecting, just by looking inward at our own thoughts, we could fully understand our own minds.
So, if we just think about thinking hard enough, we'll have all the answers.
Right. But Flanagan would say, not so fast. He says that there's way more to consciousness than what we can access just by thinking about thinking.
Okay, so there's this whole layer of feeling and experiencing that's a lot harder to grasp, even with introspection.
Exactly. And then you have the behaviorists, like Gilbert Ryle, who are all about ignoring internal states altogether. They argued that we should only study what we can directly observe behavior, and they thought talking about internal mental states was meaningless.
So no feelings, no thoughts, just actions.
Right. And this, of course, completely misses that phenomenal aspect that Flanagan's emphasizing.
Because it's about what's happening on the inside, not just the outward behavior.
Precisely. It's like trying to understand a movie just by looking at the projector.
You're missing the whole point.
Totally.
Yeah.
Or trying to explain the beauty of a sunset just by talking about wavelengths of light.
You're missing the experience of the sunset, the feeling of awe.
Yeah, exactly. And, there's another school of thought called functionalism that Flanagan grapples with, too. This idea tries to explain mental states purely in terms of their functions, their inputs and outputs, what they do.
Okay, so it's kind of like saying pain is just a signal that your body sends to your brain when there's damage. It's just a function, a reaction.
Yeah, exactly. And while that might be part of it, Flanagan would say it's not the whole picture. It's like describing what a hammer does. You hit things with it, but you're not actually describing what it feels like to hold the hammer, to swing it, to hit that nail.
Right, you're not getting at the subjective experience of using the hammer.
Right. And so even if we had this perfect functional description of every single mental process, every input and output, we'd still be missing that crucial what it feels like element.
That subjective experience, the phenomenal part.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And this leads us to one of those really big debates in the philosophy of mind. Materialism versus dualism.
The age-old question, is it all just physical stuff, or is there something more?
Right. So materialism, this basically says that everything in the universe, our minds included, is ultimately just physical stuff. No soul, no mystical energy, just matter and its interactions.
Okay, so no ghosts in the machine, so to speak.
Right. But here's the thing. Flanagan actually challenges that view. He argues that consciousness doesn't what's called supervene on the physical, meaning you can't fully explain it just by looking at physical facts.
Okay, so supervene.
Yeah, supervene, I know, it's a little jargony.
It is.
But basically it means that one thing depends on another.
Okay.
So in this case, it would mean consciousness depends on the physical stuff of the brain. But what Flanagan is saying is that even if we knew everything about the physical workings of your brain down to the last atom, we still couldn't logically figure out what it feels like to be you.
Okay, so there's this gap between the physical stuff and the feeling of consciousness.
Exactly. Consciousness has this extra layer, this subjective quality that you just can't fully explain by physical facts alone.
Okay, so I'm starting to see why consciousness is such a tricky problem.
It is.
But how does Flanagan even back up this claim? Like, how do you even argue against the idea that it's all just physical?
He uses thought experiments, those classic philosophical tools.
Ah, yes, the philosopher's playground.
Right. And one of the big ones he talks about is these hypothetical beings called zombies.
Zombies. Okay, so we're not talking about the flesh-eating kind, right?
No, not the brain-hungry kind. These zombies are creatures that are physically identical to us in absolutely every way, but they have zero conscious experience.
So they look like us, act like us, but there's no one home, so to speak, no feeling of being.
Exactly. No inner experience. And then he's got another thought experiment, the inverted spectrum scenario.
Inverted spectrum. All right, I'm intrigued.
So imagine someone whose color experiences are totally flipped from yours. So what you see is red, they experience is green.
Whoa, that's wild. So their world would look completely different from mine.
On the surface, maybe not. Because the interesting thing is that they could still pass every vision test. They would describe colors the same way we do. Stop signs are red, the sky is blue. But their subjective experience, the actual feeling of seeing those colors, would be totally different.
So it's like their internal world is a mirror image of ours, but we'd never know just by looking at them or talking to them.
Exactly. And these thought experiments, they're powerful because they force us to really confront this idea. The physical facts of the brain might not be the whole story when it comes to consciousness.
Okay, so there's this potential gap between what's happening in the brain and what it actually feels like to experience the world.
Right. There might be this extra non-physical dimension that we need to consider.
So where does that leave Flanagan on the whole mind-body problem? Is he saying we need to ditch materialism and jump on the dualism train?
Yeah.
The idea that mind and body are totally separate things.
Not quite. He actually proposes this middle ground. It's a view he calls naturalistic dualism.
Naturalistic dualism. Okay, break that down for me.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, I know.
Yeah.
But basically, it means that consciousness, it is dependent on the physical world. That's where the naturalistic part comes in.
Yeah, okay.
But it also has its own distinct non-physical properties.
So it's connected to the physical, but it also has this extra layer, this non-physical element.
Right. He compares it to how matter and energy were once considered to be completely separate things, but now we know they're actually different aspects of the same fundamental reality.
Oh, okay, I see. So it's not that there's this ghostly mind floating around separate from the brain, but there's more to the story than just neurons firing.
Exactly. Consciousness emerges from the physical world,
Hmm.
but it also plays by its own unique set of rules. It has properties that we can't fully capture just by looking at the physical stuff.
Okay, I'm with you so far, but how does this naturalistic dualism actually work? Like, how do we bridge that gap between the physical stuff of the brain and the subjective feeling of consciousness? Does Flanagan give us any clues about how those two things connect?
He does. He introduces these principles of coherence, and they're basically a set of ideas that try to link the phenomenal aspect of consciousness, the what it feels like part, to the psychological aspect, the how the brain works part.
Okay, so it's an attempt to connect the subjective experience to the actual mechanics of the brain.
Exactly. And one of the key principles is that consciousness is really tightly linked to a system's capacity for awareness.
Awareness, so not just receiving information, but being able to use that information in a meaningful way.
Right. It's about being able to access and process information to guide actions, make decisions, have that global control.
Okay, so being aware means being able to use the information you're receiving to interact with the world.
Right. And to illustrate this, he talks about this fascinating phenomenon called blind sight. So people with blind sight, they've got damage to a certain part of their brain, and they'll report being completely blind in a part of their visual field.
So they literally can't see anything in that area.
They say they can't. But here's the thing. If you show them something in that blind spot and ask them to guess what it is, they'll get it right way more often than chance.
So their brain is still processing the visual information, but they're not consciously aware of it.
Exactly. And for Flanagan, this suggests that consciousness isn't just about information processing in general, but about a specific kind of information processing that involves global access, global control.
It's not just about seeing, it's about being able to use what you see.
Right. It's about having that information available for flexible, goal-oriented behavior.
Okay, that is super interesting. But these principles of coherence, they seem pretty high level. Like, how do we get down to the nuts and bolts of consciousness? Are there actual, like, fundamental laws that connect the physical brain to the phenomenal experience?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And Flanagan argues that, yes, we need something similar to the fundamental laws of physics, laws that connect those basic properties of experience with simple features of the physical world.
So we need laws of consciousness.
In a way, yeah. And he points out the limitations of some of these high-level principles, like organizational invariance. This idea that if two systems are organized the same way, they should have the same conscious experience.
So just because two brains are structured similarly doesn't mean they'll feel the same way.
Exactly. And this is where things get even more interesting. Flanagan brings in this concept called the double aspect principle.
Couple aspect principle. Okay, lay it on me.
So this is the idea that information itself has both a physical and a phenomenal aspect.
Hold on, you're saying information isn't just this abstract concept, but it actually has a built-in experiential component.
That's exactly what Flanagan is proposing. Information isn't just about bits and bytes. There's this hidden experiential dimension to it. And this is where he brings up the example of a simple thermostat.
So a thermostat, it gets information about the temperature, right? And then it uses that information to adjust the heating or cooling system. So is Flanagan saying that a thermostat, like, actually has some basic level of consciousness? Is it, like, feeling something?
It might sound a little out there, I know, but yeah, that's the kind of question that Flanagan's ideas really push us to consider. If information itself has this phenomenal aspect, this experiential dimension, then maybe consciousness isn't just limited to brains. Maybe it's a much more fundamental property of the universe.
Wow, okay. That is definitely something to think about. So where does this all lead us? What are the implications of this, especially when we start talking about artificial intelligence?
Well, for one thing, it challenges this idea that consciousness is something that's exclusive to biological systems, right? Like if information really does have this dual aspect, this physical and phenomenal side, then any system that processes information in the right way, whether it's a brain or a really complex computer, could theoretically give rise to consciousness.
So our understanding of what it means to be conscious, that might have to expand way beyond what we can even imagine right now.
Exactly. And that brings up a ton of ethical considerations, things we need to be thinking about now. Like, what if we actually create machines that are truly conscious, machines that can experience the world in ways that we can barely even fathom?
It's kind of a mind-blowing idea. What would our obligations be to those beings?
That's a huge question. Would we treat them as tools? Or would they deserve the same rights and considerations as any other conscious being?
It's both exciting and terrifying at the same time. I mean, imagine a world where AI isn't just intelligent, but actually sentient.
Right. It's a profound question, and it's one that Flanagan definitely doesn't shy away from. He argues that if we do manage to create conscious AI, it would fundamentally change how we understand ourselves and our place in the universe.
Because we wouldn't be alone anymore. We wouldn't be the only beings on this planet capable of having subjective experiences. Wow. We've covered so much ground today. I mean, from the very definition of consciousness to the possibility of conscious machines, it feels like we've barely scratched the surface of Owen Flanagan's The Conscious Mind.
And that's the beauty of philosophy, right? It opens up more questions than it answers, but those questions, they're worth wrestling with. And Flanagan, he gives us this really powerful framework for thinking about consciousness in a new way, a way that forces us to confront the very nature of experience and the possibilities of the future.
So, to all our listeners out there, if you're even a little bit intrigued by these ideas, definitely check out The Conscious Mind. It's a wild ride. And as you delve deeper into this mystery, we'll leave you with one final thought. If we were to create these conscious artificial beings, how would our responsibilities to them and their impact on the world reshape our understanding of what it means to be human? That's something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.